Center for Child Counseling is honored to officially open Lead the Fight 2022, giving children with trauma a voice. Our champion sponsor, First Republic Bank, wishes you a warm welcome.
And thank you, First Republic. Good evening, everyone, as you're joining us. I'm Ashley Glass, your MC tonight. I'm the co-anchor of CBS 12 News This Morning, starting each weekday morning, dark and early at 5 a.m. We cover critical news of the day from the Palm Beaches of Florida up to the Treasure Coast. As a journalist of 20 years, a mom to two little precious girls, no story is more critical from my point of view than those impacting our youth. One of the reasons I am so glad to be with you tonight. We will hear some of those stories this evening and learn how to come together to give children with trauma a voice. It's my sincere belief that if we as a community can't wrap our children with unwavering feelings of love and safety, we are certain to have much bigger, irreparable problems in the road ahead. Lead the Fight 2022, giving children with trauma a voice, is now in its sixth year. Lead the Fight is an international event bringing community sector leaders from the US and around the globe together to learn, strategize, and take action to end child abuse and neglect. The American Academy of Pediatrics defines adverse child experiences as trauma, as here's how they describe it: the public health issue of our time. This statement to it predated the COVID-19 pandemic, with its enduring stress on our children and families, making ACEs as urgent a topic as ever before. We know that many adult mental and physical health issues are a direct result of early childhood traumas, such as growing up in poverty or surrounded by violence. The impact of ACEs is far-reaching. It can also determine a child's potential for educational and socioeconomic strength. We often see this unfold in the daily news cycles, and these stories always leave me asking, as I knew, same for a lot of viewers at home, what more can we do, and how can we all be part of the solution? So there's the teenager Ryan Rogers from Palm Beach Gardens, out for a bicycle ride in December of last year, allegedly murdered by a homeless drifter with no ties to the area or to Ryan. It was completely random. There's the story just this month, a Jupiter couple accused of locking their adopted son in a cage in the family garage with other children living in the home, and the teenager going to school, all the while masking the nightmare and trauma he was experiencing at home. I spent much of the day today at a local elementary school talking to school counselors about the stress and trauma on students almost 2 years into this pandemic. I had the privilege of interviewing a single mom to 3 little boys. She described to me being on the brink of homelessness throughout this pandemic, experiencing violence, domestic abuse in her household, all the while the stressors of the pandemic just weighing down her family. This mother has pulled herself and pulled her 3 little boys, out of these traumatic experiences, and she has done that by relying largely on the help of the community, school-based resources, and the community as a whole. We are here tonight to talk about such solutions, ways we can lead the fight as a community to eradicate the awful experiences and many more like it that I just described. The Center for Child Counseling, our host today, collaborates with individuals and organizations to bring healing and prevention to the ACEs crisis. This year's theme is Giving Children with Trauma a Voice. It inspires us to listen to children whose voices have been stifled by fear and give them the tools to speak with hope. ACEs studies over recent decades were instrumental in teaching us about the negative impact of adversity on children's development and long-term health. Through research and practice, we know therapy, positive relationships, caring adults, and a sense of belonging buffer and heal the scars of childhood trauma. Adversity does not mean a death sentence. With the help of a caring community, resilience grows and builds through each adversity overcome. Won't you join us in taking this giant step forward to be a positive force and end ACEs? All you have to do is know your role in creating trauma-informed communities, Be a buffering influence in the life of a child who needs you and likely needs you right now. Right now, I want to view a short video from the Center for Child Counseling, sharing initiatives to educate parents, caregivers, educators, individuals, all of us, in the power of positive support and protection. Let's watch it now.
Hi, I'm Renee Lehman. I'm President and CEO at Center for Child Counseling. Since 1999, we've been building the foundation for playful, healthful, and hopeful living for children, families, and communities. At the heart of our mission is helping children develop mental well-being and lifelong resilience. A big part of what we do is prevention and early intervention. We believe that we don't have to wait for a child to fall apart before we do something. So we are building the capacity of caregivers, adult caregivers in a child's life, to promote their mental health and resilience. That includes educating teachers, parents, foster parents, any adult caregivers to build their capacity to implement effective strategies to promote resilience. So in the classroom, at home, as a result of the pandemic and social isolation, we reimagined all of our work and implementing online training, workshops, and support for adult caregivers that needed effective strategies to help children. As mental health professionals, we can't do it all. We need to shift. We need to reimagine everything that we're doing right now. We need to figure out collectively how to build the capacity of our community to address mental health. So equipping caregivers, teachers, parents, foster parents, the system at large with ways to help children cope and heal it's critical. It's vitally important. And so in addition to the mental health treatment that we provide through our 7 clinical programs, we're looking through our education and prevention services to really develop ways to help our community heal and cope and build lifelong resilience.
I want to remind everyone, as you are watching and participating in this discussion, please participate. Use the chat feature to ask questions of our speakers this evening, and we will be addressing some of those questions in just a little bit. At this time, too, we could not be happier to bring in our keynote speaker with you with the very latest from the field. Mr. Benjamin Perks is the renowned head of campaigns and advocacy in the Division of Global Communications and Advocacy at the United Nations Children's Fund in New York. Ben leads public and policy advocacy on issues related to the survival, development, and protection of children. He's a member of the Policy Advisory Group on the Global Partnership to End Violence Against Children, and is senior fellow at the Jubilee Center at the University of Birmingham in the UK, which researches education policy on character, social, and emotional development of children. He holds a master's degree in international relations from the University of Kent at Canterbury, recently completed the Harvard Graduate School of Education on Leadership and Education Reform program. He is recognized as a public speaker, blogger, and influencer on violence against children and adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. If you have not viewed his TEDx talk or followed him on Twitter and his blog, you are missing out. You can connect with him from Center for Child Counseling's Lead the Fight webpage. Please join me right now in welcoming in Mr. Ben Perks. Ben, welcome to you.
Thank you so much, Ashley, and it is truly a delight to join you and the Center for Child Counseling. We're really impressed with the campaign and the work that you're doing in Palm Beach County. You're very much at the forefront of a growing global movement to end abuse and neglect for every child everywhere in the world. And this is very much aligned with our aspirations in the United Nations, UNICEF, World Health Organization, and other partner organizations. COVID-19 has, of course, been a turbo booster for every vulnerability, risk, and inequality in the lives of children and families. But as we look beyond the pandemic and to a hopeful recovery, perhaps it's time to really reimagine building a world without abuse and neglect. Intergenerational trauma is perhaps the most widespread and most costly, and yet least talked about social problem in our world. Intergenerational trauma plants itself early in the life cycle through what the Center for Disease Control and the World Health Organization call adverse childhood experiences, violence and abuse, neglect, and dysfunctional parenting. The seeds can be sown very early in childhood, and as scientists recently affirmed, even in the womb during pregnancy. First and foremost, adverse childhood experiences are a source of misery and anguish for the child in the moment that they occur. To paraphrase Stephen Porges, trauma is the disruption of connections, the connections that should be there for every child, the connections that protect and nurture us. Like literacy and numeracy, our capacity for relationships are built from the foundations up. It is sequential, and first base is a strong parental attachment. For children, safety is not just the absence of violence, it's the presence of love. When love is not there, the child interprets it as a threat and a risk, and it activates the stress response system if not soothed. This is something that Harvard Center for the Developing Child have called toxic stress, and toxic stress derails every aspect of child development. The way we are nurtured in early childhood determines our view of how lovable we are, how safe the world is, and how trustworthy others are. In most cases, it determines our view of those things for life. As babies, we are biologically programmed to nestle within the loving connection of a caregiver or parent. The connection is not a luxury, it's part of our evolutionary biology. We are dependent on adults for longer in the life cycle than any other species. We depend on them for three things: for love, for nurture, and for protection. We have a biological need to be loved, and that biological need doesn't set in when we're old enough to watch Love Actually or read Shakespeare. It's there from day one. When I think about love and how do you define it from a scientific perspective, the New York Times columnist David Brooks gave a really good definition of what love could mean. Love could be defined as the promotion and protection of another person's internal emotional world. Every child needs to have their inner world promoted and protected. Failure to promote and protect it is not always intentional. Parents who have grown up with emotional poverty themselves often just replicate automatically their own experiences. They think that's normal. As a British person in the United States, you constantly get asked about this stiff upper lip and the emotional coldness in things like The Crown and Downton Abbey, where emotional poverty sits alongside financial wealth. Emotional poverty occurs in a whole range of different contexts. It is a universal thing. And I honestly believe that in a more informed and enlightened era, historical sociologists will look, and social historians will look back at that stiff upper lip attitude and see it as a kind of a society's way of managing unprocessed trauma. Children don't come with a handbook, and parenting is largely automatic and instinctive. But what if our instincts are distorted by an early deficit of love? Could we support every parent in Palm Beach County and all over the world to overcome this, to learn parenting and to break that intergenerational cycle of trauma? Children ask 100 questions an hour, first by eye movement and by babbling, then pointing, and then with language. The response of the parent to those questions affirms attachment and enables language acquisition as the foundation for relationships and for learning. President Obama famously quoted the research suggests children in poverty or children affected by adversity hear literally millions less words by the time they arrive at primary or elementary school. At this early stage in life, the seeds of inequality are already being planted. This is the tragic early cost of poverty and adverse childhood experiences. At around the age of 3, children's questions switch from what and when to how and why. And this is the moment when they are very ready for a much broader network of connections through preschool, with peers and with teachers in moderately structured learning through play. Research from the Global PISA survey of over almost 60 countries shows that children do not go to preschool between 3 and 6, on average, are between 1 and 2 years behind in maths, science, and language at 15. And that contributes to intergenerational cycles of poverty. But it's also true that the more emotionally attuned and informed a parent is, the more likely they are to insist that their child goes to preschool. There are age appropriate relational milestones and building blocks that help humans evolve from babies to toddlers, from school children to amorous teenagers, to pair-bonded relationships, to parents and caregivers. Significant disruption to normal and healthy connections at any milestone or stage in that process are like a disease. They eat away at the potential for healthy development. The disruption causes anguish and pain and is contagious within families and across generations. A child deprived of healthy relations at home will struggle with relationships in preschool and school. That's because children who feel loved at home come to school to learn and to play, but children who don't feel loved at home come to school to be loved. And often they can express that need in the most unlovable of ways. And all too often, pre-K through 12 education systems are much less equipped to manage that than they should be. But we really know what a difference a great teacher can make. When COVID hit our universe, many people reached out to read the book, The Plague, by the Nobel Prize winning author Albert Camus. In fact, at the beginning of the pandemic, it topped many of the fiction reading lists and charts. Many people don't know that the Nobel Prize winning author was a victim of adverse childhood experiences, and it was a teacher that helped him to find a way through, who made a deep connection with him and supported him to continue with his studies when he was at risk of being enrolled by his impoverished family into child labor. Without that teacher, we would not have had one of the 20th century's greatest writers. And when Camus got his Nobel Prize, he dedicated to the teacher. And if you want to read the dedication letter, it is in one of his other books, The First Man. And if you can read it while keeping a dry eye, I'm very impressed. It's a very moving story of how transformative teachers can be in the lives of children faced by poverty and adversity. We know that when a child believes that they are held in the heart and mind of another human being, like a teacher, they may find a way through all of that adversity and find a way to build a better future and to break the intergenerational cycle of trauma. Despite being British, I did not grow up in Downton Abbey. I grew up in the bottom 1% in my country. I grew up in a children's home. I was a kind of a less good-looking, less intelligent version of Good Will Hunting as a young man. And I had no functional family, and I was a classic example in my neighborhood of somebody that would be recruited into gangs and very high level of risk. A teacher, Jan Report, saw something in me and became the first adult in my life who truly talked with me, listened, and made me believe I mattered as an individual. I would not be here with you today if it was not for Jan Reports. And I make a point of regularly contacting her and reminding her and thanking her for that. As the late teacher par excellence, Ruth Pearson said in her wonderful TED talk that you should all watch, every child needs a champion who'll be there for them no matter what, to form a deep connection and hold them up to the highest standards and help them to achieve those standards. We live in a world powered by the love of teachers, caregivers, and parents, but we all too often take that for granted and fail to invest in it. Connections with them are the vaccine against and the medicine for adverse childhood experiences and have the power to break intergenerational trauma. One question for colleagues in Palm Beach and elsewhere to go and think about, is it possible to ensure that in our community, every parent has support to parent, to be able to parent, and every child has at least one adult champion? We talked at the beginning about adverse childhood experiences. Broadly, they are 10 things: abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, emotional or physical neglect, and household dysfunction, including witnessing addiction, crime, domestic violence, unmanaged, undiagnosed mental illness, and family breakup. We have recently learned that the higher the number of adverse childhood experiences, the greater the likelihood of broken lives in almost every area of well-being. ACEs adverse childhood experiences are the principal preventable cause of mental illness and addiction, and a contributor to obesity. They prevent learning, language acquisition, and diminish employment prospects. They increase likelihood of being a victim or perpetrator of violence or of being in prison. They also increase risk for non-communicable disease and undermine the capacity to form and maintain the type of relationships that can soothe trauma. When we see our friends or ourselves struggling with relationships, self-confidence, or agency, there are often underlying ACEs. Those with the greatest experience of childhood adversity, with 6 adverse childhood experiences or more, are found to have 20 years on average less life expectancy. Research from over 37 countries, Russia, Sri Lanka, many European countries, Saudi Arabia, many diverse and different types of countries show remarkably similar prevalence of adverse childhood experiences. On average, around 60% of any given population have had one adverse childhood experience, and somewhere around 15% have had 4 or more. The data correlates with other global data sets on related issues. UNICEF global research on physical punishment, Council of Europe research on child sex abuse. When we put these different data sets together, they tell an amazing similar story, and it's a global story. And this is not a new problem. The earliest ACE survey reflected children who'd grown up in the 1950s and 60s and found then that 63% of respondents had 1 ACE and 12.5 had 4 or more. So it's not a new problem. It's a long-standing problem. It may have been much worse in the past, but it's something we're only beginning to shine the light on now through evidence and research and science. Those with 4 or more ACEs are at significantly higher risk for smoking, heavy alcohol use, cancer, heart disease, respiratory disease, and at much stronger risk for things like sexual risk-taking, mental illness, ill health, and addiction. ACEs are a substantial but largely hidden contribution to the World Health Organization Global Burden of Disease Estimates, which is the way we calculate disease and illness throughout the world. And listen to this, in North America and Europe alone, just the health outcome costs of ACEs are 1.3 trillion annually. They could be prevented for just a fraction of that cost. ACEs are not only a public health and addiction issue, they're also a criminal justice and a national security issue. Research from the health system in Wales in the United Kingdom shows that somebody who has had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences is 14 times more likely to be a victim of violence and 15 times more likely to be a perpetrator. In one of the strongest pieces of evidence about the link between adverse childhood experiences and intergenerational cycles of violence. I doubt that Ghislaine Maxwell, Osama bin Laden, Pablo Escobar and David Duke would have understood the language or the science of ACEs, but all of their empires and enterprises are built on the back of adverse childhood experiences. Groomers, terrorists, gangsters, and violent extremists are laser focused on identifying, targeting, and exploiting the most vulnerable teenagers. They reel them in with the promise of belonging and reward. They choose children who are already in pain, those who feel unloved or unworthy, those affected by violence. Criminal groups can sense their vulnerabilities the way top banks and law firms sense Ivy League and breeding. An investigator described how Jeffrey Epstein did this. In quotations, he created a very solid spider web of girls whose vulnerabilities he could prey on, many of whom had adversity at home and were always on the edge of homelessness. 2/3 of white supremacist group members in a survey in the US had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences, compared to just 16% of the US population overall. A study on ISIS recruitment in Northern Macedonia said that every single teacher without exception said the main determinant of who would be recruited by ISIS to go to Syria or to Iraq was that their parents didn't care about them, had a lack of care and a lack of love for the children. In London, the average person who delivers drugs is 17 or under and has an ACE score of 4 or more. To be clear, most people with high ACEs are not trafficked, radicalized, or recruited by the mafia, but the risk factor is elevated dramatically. And this is also another question I'd like to ask all of the participants on the event. Is the community that you live in doing more to exploit the children who are vulnerable, or doing more to protect them? The world is waking up to a global conversation about adverse childhood experiences. And it reminds me of something that James Baldwin said about literature. He said, you think your pain and your heartbreak are unprecedented in the history of the world, but then you read, the things that tormented me the most were the very thing that connected me with all the people who were alive, who had ever been alive. And this is the awakening and kind of the comfort that many people are finding in the ACE conversation. They're finding an explanation and an understanding of their own experience, of the ghosts that sometimes haunt them in their family's past, and how they can break that cycle for the next generation. When I tell policymakers, parliamentarians, presidents that more than half of humanity experience some form of ACE, and up to a third experience significant ACEs, they look in disbelief. And I can sympathize, because I spent most of my life believing the neglect and violence that I'd experienced in my childhood was marginal and on the fringes of society. But we all see in the media and culture the detached James Bond, the insecure Bridget Jones. We see trauma in the songs of Amy Winehouse, in the plot lines of Tolstoy and Dickens, of Hugo and Victor Hugo, the stories of Elton John, of Oprah Winfrey, of Billy Connolly. Why would we be so surprised that adverse childhood experiences and intergenerational trauma are so widespread? Most people affected by intergenerational trauma are perhaps not consciously aware of it. For many, the seeds were planted in the earliest part of life, beyond the range of memory that can be retrieved verbally. It distorted the expectations of what would follow thereafter and how life should be. There is also a mutually reinforcing and little understood relationship with historical trauma, from slavery, from the Holocaust, from apartheid, conflict and famine, that plays in and works alongside adverse childhood experiences. Intergenerational trauma came to be understood as life as it was meant to be lived. As Galit Atlas has said, everything we don't know about ourselves has the power to control and run our lives, in the same way the riptides below the surface of the ocean are its most powerful force. Most people whose lives are shaped by trauma have never had a conversation about trauma, and we need to change that. Our inability to talk about our own trauma renders us strangers to ourselves and to each other. We need a public conversation that does three things: removes judgment, stigma, and shame, demystifies the issue of trauma and adversity, and provides literacy and numeracy on it. And thirdly, focuses on the solutions and the connections that we need to have. So what are some of the solutions? There are many, but in the United Nations, at the moment, we are focusing on really four. The first one is to try to treat parenting programs that give a basic package of guidance and support on parenting and affirm attachment and skills, to treat them like a vaccine that should be available to every parent in the world. That we know from randomized control sites, trials in over 200 locations in the world, that they have a huge impact in improving outcomes, attachment, and preventing violence against children. And we know that James Heckman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist from the University of Chicago, has estimated that every dollar that we invest in programs like that, we get an up to a $13 return on that investment through improved life outcomes. The second thing we need to do is to ensure every child has a champion in school. Relationships with teachers and friends are a really important factor against ACEs, and they need to be central to our teacher recruitment, training, and school governance and ethos. They are essential for learning. Children who are in a state of toxic stress cannot learn. Every child should attend a school where they feel connected, respected, known, and soothed. We need to have a conversation in every single community, everywhere, and to break that taboo and recognize that whoever we're speaking to could be affected by and living with trauma. And we need to have conversations that are relevant to the local cultural context. Only through conversation can we turn the ghosts of trauma into ancestors that we can understand. And finally, we need to have a more realistic understanding of the economics of adverse childhood experiences. Trillions of dollars annually are lost, and could be prevented. They cost the public purse trillions annually and could be prevented for a fraction of that cost. Ministries of finance should analyze the costs of childhood adversity on health, well-being, crime, violence, and addiction, and adjust government budgets to focus on prevention and response. There are so many other things that can contribute to reducing adverse childhood experiences. In America, the richest country on the planet, we have a real problem with parental leave, which is a key issue for prevention of ACEs and strengthening childhood attachment. We also need to ensure that we have universal access for every 3 to 6 year old to preschool education. We need family-friendly and trauma-informed workplaces. These are all things, the 4 things that I mentioned as our priorities are things that we're really focusing on in low and middle income countries, but wealthy countries like America can do much, much more. I just want to say that whenever I tell people that we want to end abuse and neglect in the world, they often look at us as if we're crazy. But we think we have some good historical lessons to draw on in all of this, and we think that it's very doable. We need to address child trauma and adverse childhood experiences in the way we have tried to address COVID-19, to make sure that everybody knows about the risk, that we interrupt transmission through prevention, and that we ensure recovery through timely response. When I get pushback more recently on my passionate belief that we can end abuse and neglect, I think of the really selfless comments of the bereaved father and US Congressman Jamie Raskin, who reminded us that most parents that have ever been have witnessed the death of a child. We forget that the robust prevention of childhood mortality through vaccines and other public health measures is relatively new. In the 1980s, 3 things happened. Global vaccination coverage of under 5s against the major childhood diseases increased from 20% coverage of children in the world to 80%. What followed was that child mortality reduced by 61%, and the world stopped being a place where it was acceptable that children would die from preventable disease. We no longer saw that as inevitable. Could we honor those public health pioneers by ourselves being the generation that brings us to the point where intergenerational trauma and adverse childhood experiences are no longer seen as inevitable or unpreventable? Maya Angelou said, "There's no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you." Together, we can end that agony for every child. We can end abuse and neglect and build a world truly fit for every child everywhere. Thank you.
Ben, that was incredible. Also awesome that so many people participated during that discussion from you, Ben. I want to share one comment coming in from Jessica. She wrote, "This education is for everyone." Everyone in all caps. And she commented, "So important that other young children understand how and recognize ACEs in their friends and peers and how to be empathetic and kind." Well said, Ben. Thank you so much for that compelling update, how leaders from all over the world, as he described, are working together with the United Nations Children's Fund to fight violence against our children. We look forward, Ben, to following your progress, and I know you'll be joining us again just a little later on. So it is now time to introduce our featured speaker for this evening. Julius Gunta is a children's writer, a member of Jamaica's National Task Force on Character Education, and an advocate in the Caribbean's Adverse Childhood Experiences movement. Julius holds a BA in Media and an MA in Peace Studies. His work explores the links between toxic stress and academic underachievement and the very effects of false positivity and emotional invalidation on the choices and hopes of survivors of complex trauma. His first book, Tata and the Big Bad Bull, was published in 2018. We are so fortunate this evening to enjoy a reading from his new book, Rohan Bulkid and the Shadows, a story about aces and hope, published in December by Caribbean Reads. But first, let's meet Julius. We're going to ask him a couple of questions, get to know him, get to know his remarkable journey from childhood to today as he joins us tonight. Please help me welcome Mr. Julius Gunta to Lead the Fight 2022. And Mr. Gunta will be joining us from Japan. So let's give him just a minute to be able to log on with us and join us, Mr. Gunta.
I'm on. Can you see me?
Hi, there you are, sir. You are joining us all the way from Japan for this very important discussion, and we're lucky enough that you'll be sharing a reading from your new book very shortly. First, tell us why Japan. Why have you relocated yourself to live and work in Japan?
Thank you, Ashley. This is actually my second time in Japan. I was here back in 2014 during the height of my struggles with trauma. I lived for a couple of years in the Eastern Caribbean and then 2 years in Jamaica's Blue Mountains, practicing what I now understand was bibliotherapy and expressive writing. And I came to Japan to continue that journey. I returned recently to Japan a few months ago to complete 2 new picture books and a collection of poems, and to get the prerequisites that I need to get a place in a master's in psychology program in Canada. So I have a lot of work to do before I leave here in a couple of years.
Well, we are so glad you're with us tonight, Mr. Gunta. Please give us an overview of your new book that you'll be sharing a reading from tonight. Tell people what it's all about.
Rohan Bulking on the Shadows came from a very deep, deep place inside of me. When I held a copy of the book for the first time, I think what I felt more than anything else was a deep sense of relief. This is a book about my life, my story, my experiences as a survivor of about 18 adverse childhood experiences. Not all of these are covered in the book. The book is separated into 3 sections. It begins with a letter to grown-ups, and then there's a story. And at the back of the book, there is an overview of adverse childhood experiences, and it follows the story of Rohan Bulking, a boy who struggles to read. And this is a part of the conversation that I think we need to have, the impact of adverse childhood experiences on children's academic capabilities. And it shows how Rohan struggles with his family life, and how, with the support of a magical book and members of his community, he managed to make sense of some of those difficulties and to achieve a measure of healing.
Mr. Gunta, what's your process? How do you get yourself in that place, that very vulnerable place, I would imagine, where you're able to, share these stories, you're able to, put it to paper? What is your process to write this kind of book?
I feel like I have always lived in this place. And in some ways, this is a very tragic thing. I understand why it's so difficult for some people to return to trauma, but my whole life was traumatic, I feel. And I spent, I would say, the first 25, 28 years of my life trying to make sense of these difficulties. And I was fortunate just recently, just as an example, to be able to sleep through a night for the first time in my life. And I've been sleeping now for about 2 years. So as just an example, as an 11-year-old, I learned to read when I was 11 years old. I went to school for the first time when I was 5 years old because my mother, a single parent, was not able to send my older sister and I. And so I started life with a great disadvantage. And at 14 years old, I was thrown under the street by my family and moved into my 10th home and lived alone from age 14 to 17. And so I've spent much of my life trying to make sense of the psychosis, the depression, the voices in my head that plagued me during that time and that persisted throughout my adult life. So it's interesting that even though I struggled because of that darkness, I also found light in that darkness and the solitude in books like the Harry Potter series that gave me permission to make my life magical, to believe that reading and literature could change my life.
And it is such a light to all of us that you're here tonight and you're able to so openly, share these stories in a book, here during this discussion. were there parts of the book that were especially easy for you to write, that it just flowed? And then in contrast, were there parts where you struggled, to really explain, your personal experience? I'm just curious, the bumps in the road in the journey of writing a book, where was it easy and where was it difficult for you?
So interesting. The whole thing was difficult. It was difficult for me. I started this book as part of my journey at the University of Bradford, where I studied peace studies. And even though that was in the realm of international politics, I focused on internal violence and did my dissertation on adverse child experiences and autoethnography, so a study of my life. And I started that in 2018. The book in 2018 or so, and it took me 4.5 years to complete it. And it was difficult. I've told a number of people that the book went through about 500 drafts. And that's a whole lot of drafts for a picture book to go through.
Yes.
It was hard. The whole thing was hard. And this is something that I need people to understand about me, particularly children. I have produced a few pieces of literature now, and all of this has come at it has been difficult. It has been very difficult for me. I've had to show great resolve and determination and resilience to produce what I have produced. It was really, really hard to write this book. And there were moments when things became very difficult with illustrators who didn't understand what we were trying to do, with the publisher, and we felt like we were going to scrap this project. So none of it, to be honest, was easy at all.
500 drafts, you stayed the course, and we're so glad you did. What has the reaction been like? I mean, I'm sure the reaction's been varied, especially from educators, since, as you just described, part of this, relates to ACEs and its impacts on a child and their learning capabilities. So what has been the reaction to this, book, especially from educators?
Very, very positive. We received many great endorsements from educators across the Caribbean, the United States, and New Zealand, Canada, people in the ACEs movement, such as Jane Stevens, who founded PACES Connections. We received endorsements that we have not published, such as one from Dr. Bruce Perry, who co-authored the book with Oprah Winfrey recently. And recently from Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who I think is the outgoing Surgeon General of California. So many positive results. But interestingly, many reviewers have been hesitant to review this book. So that is a problem
How so?
for us. They don't want to touch this subject. This is one of the problems we have in children's literature. And Ben alluded to this, where there's this feeling that we should not engage children in these kinds of difficult conversations. And we had to let one of our illustrators go because she was not willing to represent some of the experiences in the book, in the illustrations, in the ways that we wanted her to do so. So that has been a challenge. With my first book, Tata and the Big Bad Bull, several of the reviewers who happily reviewed that book said no to reviewing this one.
You described that it was not an easy road. The whole thing, as you said, it was difficult, multiple drafts, bumps on the road like you just described, but, it's come to tonight, and we're so lucky that you are sharing a reading from your book with us now. I'm going to let you take it away, Mr. Gunta.
Thank you. So I'm actually going to read the whole book because I want people who are here to have a full understanding of the story. And if I have time at the end, I will speak about an important subplot in the story and about key illustrations that can be used as points of discussion about various issues that are related to trauma and ACEs. So the book is separated into 3 parts. This is the first part, a letter to grown-ups, which I'll read now. Over the past 20 years, Extensive research on adverse childhood experiences has revealed strong connections between early adversity and many children's academic weaknesses, disruptive behaviors, and negative health and life outcomes. Rohan Bulking on the Shadows aims to help survivors of ACEs and toxic stress by giving them a medium through which to explore their experiences, particularly their struggles with reading and academic work. The book also highlights the need to find transformative ways of engaging with perpetrators of ACEs and the role families and communities can play in helping survivors develop resilience and hope. This story is based on true events from my childhood. It depicts some of the ordeals, adult behaviors, and social realities that shaped my life and the lives of many of my peers. As a survivor of multiple ACEs, I am engaged in a lifelong journey to understand and reduce their impacts. Healing is an ongoing process, but what I have already learned has not only given me an understanding of the complex literacy and health challenges I have endured, it has also led to significant improvements in my well-being and relationships with others. In addition to my life, the book draws inspiration and text from How to Read, an essay by Jamaican human rights advocate Marcus Garvey. It also has an appendix that provides a brief overview of ACEs. We recommend that you use this book as an entry point to conversations on ACEs and toxic stress. We hope it will inspire you to do further research and to join communities that are working to reduce the prevalence of ACEs around the world. Rohan Bulkin hates reading. Everyone knows this. His teachers, classmates, everyone, including the shadows. The shadows know Rohan better than he knows himself. Rohan can sense them, but he doesn't know what they are, that they fuel his fear of books, that they do not want him to become a good reader. Every time he picks up a book, the shadows cause his mind to flicker like light bulbs in a hurricane. Sometimes his mind goes completely blank, as though he's walking in the dark in a strange place. Other times it refuses to shut down, making him feel like he's in a race without an end. In those moments, the more Teacher Morgan curses him for reading poorly, for failing tests, for staring into space, the deeper his hatred for books and reading grows. When he feels like this, he rips pages from textbooks, folds them into airplanes, and hurls them across the classroom. The shadows like this. The shadows like it when Rohan goes into the library, hides where no one can see him, pulls books from the shelves, and rips their pages or doodles along their margins with pens. The next time Rohan goes into the library, a book called How to Read pushes itself over the edge of the shelf so that Rohan picks it first. He attempts to rip its cover. "Why are you ripping my cover?" How to Read asks. Rohan drops the book, steps back, his legs shaking. How to Read hovers before him. "Let's be friends." "Books are not your friends," the shadows grow. Rohan thinks hard about where to go, who to trust with the idea of talking books, who to talk to about the flickering bulbs in his head. He thinks of his classmates, but fears they will laugh and jeer. He thinks of Teacher Morgan, but she believes he's a troublemaker and doesn't seem interested in how he feels. He thinks of home, and his mind goes blank. Sometimes his home is a hurricane. That night, like many nights, Rohan has a nightmare. The shadows pull him into a deep, dark hole. He cries out, but no one hears him. Rohan wakes up thinking of the talking book. "I could use a friend," he mutters. He takes a deep breath and rushes to the library. I know what the shadows do to you, How to Read says. Let me help you discover what they are. Rohan stares at the talking book. How will you do this? He asks. By helping you to improve your reading, the book replies. Reading can help you discover a world of stories, ideas, and dreams, including stories about shadows and ideas on how to confront them. The more you know about yourself and the world, the less influence shadows will have in your life. Are all books magical like you? Rohan asks. Most books are magical. Some are medicine, some are mirrors, some are bridges, some are keys, some are windows to new ways of seeing, feeling, and being. Read these books and you'll discover your magical powers too. Books are not magical, the shadows grow. Rohan is so excited he barely hears them. Teach me, he says, teach me to read well. Over the next few months, How to Read teaches Rohan the keys to becoming a good reader. Find a tutor who appreciates the magical books, How to Read says, one who treats you kindly and makes you feel safe. Some books are full of pictures, others are full of words that don't make sense at first. Rohan looks up words he doesn't know and studies them. Reading becomes easier and easier. When going on long journeys, read until you get there. If you're waiting for somebody, read until the person comes, How to Read says. Sometimes the shadows cause Rohan to become so distressed that he flips through books quickly. Whenever he does this, stories don't make much sense. How to Read reminds him to read every word and to study pictures carefully until he understands what the stories mean. If the book belongs to you, How to Read tells him, highlight new words and interesting ideas and write them down in your notebook of words and ideas. Miss Cheryl helps Rohan decorate the covers of his notebook with bright colors and artwork. Share what you've learned with others. Not everyone will listen, but some people will. Do not let fear stop you from speaking your truth. Remember to take breaks or play an exercise. Exercise will make your brain work better, Miss Cheryl says. Rohan reads books that make him cry, laugh, think, and imagine new worlds. Books about continents, cultures, customs. Books about wizards, witches, wonders. Books about monsters, muses, music. Books about space, seas, spirits. Some of these books talk about how shadows roam throughout our bodies, controlling what we think and feel and how we act. And this is how the once nameless, shapeless, mysterious shadows start to become clear. Rohan can see them around him, feel them pour from him, bad memories, negative emotions, fears. He has learned that what makes his mind go blank or refuse to shut down is stress caused by his bad experiences, including his memories and thoughts of hurtful people, scary places, and hardships in his life. He now knows that the bad experiences that have happened to him have often made it difficult for his brain to work well. He has learned too that none of this is his fault, that the love and support of others will help him to get better, and that many people are working toward a world in which fewer children will have bad experiences. He now knows where to find some of these people. All of this requires courage. Courage to appreciate that life can be difficult and disturbing. Courage to talk about his experiences and feelings. Courage to keep going even when the shadows are trying to stop him. Now, whenever shadows make him feel scared, Rohan's friends help him to understand what is happening, assure him that he is not alone, and give him strength to seek help and to speak up for himself and for others. And now I will read a section on adverse childhood experiences. ACEs are sources of intense stress that many children experience. including poverty, physical, emotional, or sexual abuse, neglect, community violence, racism, and peer victimization. These experiences can have harmful effects on children's brains, immune system development, and overall well-being, even when they become adults. The ACEs concept was created in the 1990s by doctors in the United States. The doctors did a study and discovered that children who are exposed to ACEs are more likely to become sick and to make bad choices than children who are not. The doctors made a list of 10 ACEs: physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, a family member who is addicted to drugs, or went to prison, or suffers from mental illness, a mother treated violently, and parental separation. Over the years, other doctors, researchers, social workers added more ACEs to the list. These include poverty, spanking, child labor, community violence, gender discrimination, racism, living in a war zone, homelessness, and several more. A person's ACE score is a tally of each bad experience. So if one of these things happen to you, it means you have one ACE or ACE. People with 4 or more ACEs are many times more likely to suffer from illnesses such as asthma, stroke, cancer, heart disease, diabetes, obesity, depression, faulty memory, and nightmares than those with no ACEs. They are also more likely to low self-esteem, to smoke, overdrink, attempt suicide, or use violence to solve problems. Many of them live in a red alert state. This means that their stress and anxieties keep their blood pressure so high that they struggle to regulate their emotions and are always on the lookout for threats. This experience is known as toxic stress response. When children experience toxic stress response continually, the parts of their brain that are responsible for the development of good literacy and social skills are often overwhelmed by the parts that focus on safety and survival. This makes it difficult for them to study, to trust others, and to simply enjoy life. Fortunately, most people who have experienced ACEs and toxic stress can recover and thrive if they get proper care and support. Some brain-related illnesses can be reversed. There are many programs and practices available that can help survivors develop resilience. These include counseling, expressive writing, bibliotherapy, art therapy, EMDR, mindfulness, yoga, adequate sleep, good food and exercise, and gentle, respectful relationships. One of the most important things we can do to help survivors overcome trauma and toxic stress is to be kind to them. We show kindness when we listen attentively to their stories and feelings and withhold judgment about why they behave the way they do. How we speak and listen to others makes a big difference in how they feel about themselves and cope during hard times. Thank you. And at the end of it, I have a very brief biography of Marcus Garvey. There's this essay entitled How to Read, which Marcus Garvey published many, many years ago. And some of the lines in this essay are threaded throughout this book, and I received permission from Garvey's estate to use it. So for those who have the book, you can read this on your own time, and I hope those who do not have the book will get copies of it. I will now check to see how much time I have left. Okay, so I have a little bit of time left, so I will go back to the front of the book to talk about the sub-story. One of the important considerations for me throughout this whole process of understanding trauma and violence within my own life, and particularly with trying to understand why my parents, my mother in particular, was so violent towards the teachers and other members of my family. It has been very difficult for me to reach this place where I am now able to see things from their perspective, to understand that they too were victims of violence, to understand how violence perpetuates in this way, to understand and make sense of intergenerational trauma. So in this book, we have this antagonist who is not mentioned in the story, but whose story is told in the illustrations. So you see here him pitching a piece of paper at Rohan, the protagonist, and looking quite angry and mischievous. There's also this young woman, this girl, who is not mentioned in the text, but also plays an important role in Rohan's journey. So teachers reading this book to children, psychologists, educators, can help children who have experiences that are evident in the journeys of these two characters, use these pictures to help those children to understand what they're going through. So that's the first illustration. Here's another one where he's in class. The protagonist is being mischievous, but you can see here that he's not engaged at all. There's something wrong with him. Why is he like that? We see him here again in class. We see him here again, he's walking, and he doesn't look happy here in this picture either. And here he is on the bus going home and making mischief. And in this illustration, we get an understanding of why he is like that. So this is an adult figure, let's say it is his mother. And you can see here that he's been roughed up a bit. And we know that, of course, there's a strong correlation between children who experience violence and the violence that they then perpetrate on themselves and on others. One report that came up in my dissertation found that boys in particular who experience physical abuse are 9 times more likely to become violent. And I often think about that in the context of violence in Jamaica, which is a huge problem. And in the final illustration, in this section, we see Tata offering an olive leaf, which is so important for these children. And this kind of thinking, of course, is not new. I'm happy that it's becoming more pervasive now, but we need to be a bit more open-minded and forgiving in our approaches to perpetrators of violence. And again, I go to the top and show very quickly something else before I close. So I want the conversation about the spoken about trauma to be as deep as possible. So these illustrations were carefully done. For example, this illustration, we have on this ship, if you can see, transatlantic. And I'm hoping that teachers will have a conversation about intergenerational trauma, about slavery, for children to have a deeper understanding of these issues. And a final illustration I'd like to show is this one, where I speak about some of the wonders of the world, remarkable people who have done great work to help us to understand these issues. This is Toni Morrison, whose book, God Save the Child, was very important for me, and other books written by Toni Morrison. And of course, this is Dr. Nadine Burke-Harris, who's known by most people here and has been such an inspiration in this global adverse child experiences movement. And finally, I am searching for a publisher for my notebook of words and ideas. And I actually created several notebooks as a primary school student at primary school in Jamaica. As an 11-year-old, I made this decision, and it had a great impact on my life, along with Miss Cheryl, who makes an appearance in this book, this teacher figure that Ben spoke about so eloquently. And I still have notebooks of words and ideas that I used to write down interesting ideas and new words and so on. And I've created a notebook with the same illustrator who worked on Rohan Rachel Moss. And I'm excited about publishing this. It's full of great quotes from writers such as Chimamanda Adichie Ta-Nehisi quotes. We got permission to use those quotes, and blank pages, lined pages, sketches of illustrations for children and older readers to color. So I'm very excited about that and looking forward to finding a publisher or releasing that by myself sometime this year. Okay, thank you very much. And now if Ms. Glass and Mr. Perks would join me, I look forward to opening the chat and taking some questions from our fellow audience members tonight. Thank you.
Mr. Gunta, thank you so much for reading that in its entirety, that picture book. The comments coming in one after the other said, thank you, thank you. Powerful was a word that kept coming through, and chills when you said he learned that it was not his fault. That was powerful. I want to share one comment too coming in from Alicia. She said, Mr. Julius, you are a superhero, a survivor, and an inspiration. We thank you so much. We got a lot of comments too, Mr. Gunta, from teachers saying, how can we best get this book in our classrooms? Do you want to speak to that? You know, for the educators watching and listening, they want to get it in their classrooms. How do they do that?
Thank you very much. I'll share an email address from the publisher shortly, and just send an email to Carl Mitchell at Carbon Reads and purchase it from her, or get it on Amazon, or ask for it at your bookstore and they'll get it for you.
And Julius, another question, when will you be in the Caribbean?
If you invite me and pay my way there, I'll be there next week.
I'm gonna put that comment, the invitation right there. Ben, I hope you're on with us again too. We had some questions coming in, and I want, both Ben and Julius to chime in on some of these. Ben, are you back with us?
Yes, I am. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. One of the first questions that came in during your talk, Ben, was, some of the people listening wanted you to explain a little more about the mechanisms behind the intergenerational transmission. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, what we see is that parents who themselves have had childhood experiences are much more likely to replicate them unless they've had an opportunity to process and contextualize and understand and recover from their own childhood trauma. So remember that childhood trauma, adverse childhood experiences can last for a lifetime, but it can be recovered when somebody has a chance to process it. What we're asking for now is global parenting programs that in a way help parents to process and understand so they don't transmit.
It was striking too, Ben, when you said failure's not always intentional. Is that awareness, of an adult that, it's not my intention that this is cyclical. Is that awareness enough to break the cycle, or, is that a good starting point?
Yeah, absolutely. All of the research in psychology tells us that if parents are able to have a vocabulary to describe and understand it, they're less likely to transmit it. Let's be clear on adverse childhood experiences. Some of them, sexual violence, physical violence, are crimes, and they are intentional, and they need to be addressed by the criminal justice system. But emotional neglect is often something where a parent themselves hasn't developed the relational tools because of emotional poverty in their own life to be able to adequately attach with the child. And that's what we talk about when we talk about unintentional. And that's why when we talk with people about adverse childhood experiences, we have to be sensitive to the fact that often people are doing their best and they need help to fulfill the needs of the child.
Ben and Julius, I'm hoping you can both speak to this next question that came in. Is it ever too late to provide the buffering to break the cycle? Ben, please speak to that first, and I'm curious to what Julius has to say about that as well. Is it ever too late?
There's a professor at University of UCL, Daniel Siegel, who tells a brilliant story about a 92-year-old guy who gets referred to the psychologist by his 72-year-old son, and goes in, starts seeing the psychologist every week, begrudgingly, and at the end of it, his wife comes to visit the psychologist and says, "Doctor, thank you so much. My husband is more loving than he's ever been in his life before. He had such emotionally desolate parents, and you've helped him to understand and recover from that." And the point was that we now know with the brain, with neuroplasticity, that people can recover from trauma at any time in the life cycle, can become aware of ACEs and recover from them. And this is the tremendous power of a human being and resilience, adaptability.
Julius, can you speak to that as well? I
Yes.
think that's a question, coming in from the people watching. Is it ever too late?
Here's an interesting response to that. So before I left Jamaica for Japan, I interviewed my mentor, Mike, who fought in the Vietnam War, in the latter part of that war. He was from Texas, a white man. And then he went back to America and struggled in America and ended up in my rural community in Jamaica, trying to find equanimity or peace of mind and to heal. And I am trying to write Michael's story that will trace his journey from America to Vietnam and to me in Pearl River. And this story at its core will explore this notion of the inner child. The idea that a person cannot heal because he or she is 92 or 95 comes from the fact that that person is that old, but all of us have these inner children inside of us. The 12-year-old Mike, who was backhanded by his father at the dinner table, who speaks to me about the remarkable journey he has been through, but who cries even today when he speaks about that particular experience. I feel like the inner child, once engaged through the remarkable strategies that have been laid out in books such as The Body Keeps the Score, Neil Burke Harris's writings, can heal at any age if given the opportunities to do so.
Ben, I want to go back to you, and I just want you both to know the questions are coming in faster than I can even handle them right now. People are so engaged in this discussion, and it's awesome to see. Ben, I want to go back to you. How does a parent handle discipline with a trauma-informed child?
How does how a parent handles discipline, I think is something you probably need to ask a parenting expert about. But some of the key things that we know is that parents need to have a consistent strategy. It needs to be informed by the latest evidence. It needs to be something that doesn't cause trauma, and it needs to be done in a way that doesn't use physical discipline or other ways of isolating or humiliating children. One of the things that we have learned very recently in child psychology is this idea of time out, right? So when a child's growing up, when a child reaches adolescence and risk comes in, if they see the parent as somebody that will send them away, they're not going to come to the parent and talk to them about risk. So it's really important that parents have consistent strategies that are based on the best knowledge of positive parenting and non-violent disciplining. In all ways, disciplining that affirms attachment and connection.
This is a question coming in right now from Bonnie. Bonnie asks, the history of all social programs in America shows that we put Band-Aids on problems rather than spending money on prevention. How do we change this prevailing attitude among our leaders?
Well, please go ahead, Ben.
No, after you, Julius.
Well, I can't necessarily speak about the situation in America, but I remember while studying at the University of Bradford, one of the interesting conversations we had there was about the liberal imposition of ideas from international NGOs, particularly from the United States of America and Europe, on indigenous states, global South countries in Africa and the Caribbean, and the ways in which people sometimes with great fancy degrees sit and come up with ideas about countries and situations that they don't understand. Recently, there's a report about the $1 trillion that Jamaica spent between 2008 to 2018 on various youth intervention programs with very negligible results. And one of the reasons for this, despite social scientists, anthropologists talking to the government about it, is that they focus on the symptoms of problems instead of on the real causes of problems. There is now a small conversation that is taking place in Jamaica about adverse child experiences, about trauma-informed care, which I think needs to be the great movement of this century, that is helping people to understand the fundamental underpinnings of violence and social dysfunction. That is happening in California, in New Jersey, United States, in many states there. But of course, there's much work that needs to be done.
Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think we need to most policymakers don't know about the costs. They don't know that the things like criminal justice, security, the health costs. We need to, I think, build up a much stronger case. Recognize that politicians deal in democracies, in election cycles, but show different expectations. It makes no sense in the United States that you have the cruelest and the worst parental leave policy of any developed country as the wealthiest country on the planet, when to be, I don't know, either a conservative or a liberal, of course you would have to support parental leave because it's at the core values of both of those idea sets. So I think we need to move child policy to the center of decision making. I think we need more women in politics because I think they champion it much more than men, and we just need to get the argument and the message across clearly about how important this is for all of society and what we lose by not investing in primary prevention.
I want to bring in a question right now from Nikki. Nikki writes, I am a survivor of multiple ACEs and have experienced many of the after effects you describe. I always feel understood and heard when I talk with someone like Julius. Do you know of any good online groups for fellow survivors?
Well, I know about PACES Connections. So PACES Connections is this network of people primarily across the United States, but all over the world, from Canada, New Zealand. We have the PACES Connections Caribbean community. And there are many groups and opportunities there for people who have gone through these experiences to connect, or just for people who want a deeper understanding of these issues. But I'm sure too, if one searches hard enough, one will find good organizations. For example, Nikki can connect with the Center for Child Counseling and find out from them what opportunities are out there since they're doing the work.
And Ben, do you have anything additional, resources, online or other, that you would suggest for fellow survivors?
Well, I mean, there's some great literature. Daniel Siegel's book, Mindsight, I think was something that I think a lot of people that have been through a recovery have found really informative. But I think that Child Counseling Center would be better placed to answer the question than I am.
I agree. I'm going to bring in a question that just came in. Again, more thanks to both of you for what you've shared, as the comments keep coming in. This one goes to Ben. Can you speak to how fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and prenatal alcohol exposure is connected to and a big part of intergenerational trauma and the misconduct and behaviors that cause ACEs?
I can't speak to that specifically, but just to acknowledge that it is one of several factors that contribute to adverse childhood experiences. It is something that affects children, and something that it contributes to poor opportunity for development. But I don't feel I've really got the expertise to speak about that issue specifically. So many apologies to the person asking the question.
No apologies necessary. Gentlemen, we have learned a lot. We have shared a lot during this discussion. As we are closing out Lead the Fight 2022, we'd like to thank our dedicated sponsors and donors, our champion sponsor, First Republic Bank, CBS 12 News, Children's Services Council of Palm Beach County,
Ward Damon, Cersei, Denny, Scarola, Barnhart, and Shipley, and Premier Pediatrics. We are especially grateful today for the time and leadership of our guests, Benjamin Perks and Julius Gunta, for your significant impact in moving our knowledge and solutions forward on behalf of children with trauma. We end every Lead the Fight event with an urgent rally cry. Here is your personal call to action to give children with trauma the voice and recognition they deserve. Get trained. Be ACEs aware and informed. Sign your place of employment or organization up for an inexpensive training that will change your view of community forever. Invest in ACEs economics. Our business leaders must get behind early childhood development to grow a future thriving economy with brilliant minds to lead it. Push the agenda. Form an ACEs action committee in your community to raise awareness, advocacy, and activism. Fund the work in your community. Donate to causes fighting ACEs to further their training, resources, and services. And we have one last announcement. We are very excited to announce that Lead the Fight 2023, pandemic permitting, is a full in-person 2-day conference, including workshops, panels, keynotes, and trainings. We look forward to sending you the dates and location very soon. We can't thank you enough for your participation today and your commitment to this fight. Good night, everyone.